if we're starting a new connection, especially if you know that there is trauma in that connection, or you're bringing trauma into this new connection, is there certain things that you've learned to be able to deal with some of these trust traumas?
Yeah, and I feel like you just walked through the process, but the start of that is, how do I recognize that it's happening in the first place? So, of course, I can acknowledge I've been cheated on. How I might recognize it in the next relationship is the mental chatter of, they're probably cheating on me, or they're probably with someone else. And then slowing down when that comes up and just asking, like, is that true? And you might still think yes. And then ask again, is it 100% true? The answer is probably no.
Hello, everyone. We're here with Johanna Adrianson, and she is a trauma expert. And we are going to talk a little bit today in relation to the connection map, and specifically around trauma. Can you just give us a little introduction? Tell us about what you've been working on and what's important to you.
Yes, I'd love to. Thank you. Thank you for having me. My name's Johanna. I'm a personal development coach and a trauma-informed practitioner. I'm studied in somatic therapy and life coaching and energy work and all of the things like coaches fill their toolbox with. But something that has definitely been in front of my conversations online has been trauma work, healing patterns, and healing all of that in relationships as well. So I'm excited to be here and have the conversation together.
What was your journey?
The more I realized that if they didn't have the mindset piece locked in, I could give them the perfect business strategy, but they weren't going to be able to execute because they were self-sabotaging and something was holding them back. And at that point, I didn't have the tools to understand other people deeply enough to be able to help them navigate that. So I removed myself from that space for a little bit, went on the journey of what I thought was going to be becoming a mindset expert, but found my way into the somatic work, which is the work of the body and the nervous system. And within that body of work, the theory is largely around this concept that you've probably heard of, that the body keeps the score. And so in our subconscious and unconscious and nervous system is where all of this stuff is held. And once I was exposed to this work and the power of trauma healing through the body, I couldn't look back because it's just too important for everyone and has so much to offer people on all spectrums of experiences. And so that's how I got here.
Can you talk a little bit about this idea of these traumas stored in the body? What does that mean practically or scientifically?
Yeah, and it is a little bit of a hard concept to grasp, especially with those words subconscious and unconscious. But being stored in the body can be quite literally within our physiological body. So chronic pain, insomnia, or different symptoms like stomach issues, headaches, all of this can actually be linked to experiences that we've had. And it's our body's way of bracing around an experience where we weren't held, where we didn't process it fully. And so that trauma turns into what can be even disease or pain, like I said, or just more psychological patterns and loops that we run.
So people can get sick just from having traumatic experiences.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that it's becoming more well known now that stress makes you sick. And stress is just this huge umbrella term for our body being dysregulated, which happens in a situation as little as stubbing your toe or as extreme as being cheated on by a partner. And so we're always going to have a stress response to that in the body. And the more it happens or the more it's held and not processed, the more it can manifest into something more extreme.
What are the extreme ones?
Of course, like the big words like cancer and disease, autoimmune disease, there's lots of research that is suggesting that trauma can be the beginning of those things manifesting in the body. And Dr. Gabor Mate does a lot of research on this. He has a book called When the Body Says No, and the book The Body Keeps the Score both speak to this concept.
Tell us more about that. I feel like not a lot of people really understand that.
I feel like the connections that are made in that body of research are so obvious and so mind-blowing at the same time. So we can learn from a very young age, for example, that our anger should not be expressed. And this often happens in the case of men, especially, where anger is too powerful. And collectively, we are scared of the masculine anger because it can come with a lot of strength. Anyway, on a child level, a young boy might be told not to get angry, don't yell, don't throw a tantrum. So all of this energy that wants to be expressed out of his body, where does it go? It stays in the body. And that's a lot of intensity in the body. And when we have intensity in our body, that intensity wants to be met by something else. And so often we either turn inwards or we end up expressing outwards in an unhealthy way. inward, meeting that intensity can come with self-harming or abusing our bodies through drugs or alcohol. And outward can be being unable or uncontained in the expression of the anger. So fighting or becoming very volatile and feeling like you're out of control, even when the intention is to be in control.
What are some of the most common traumas that you see that people are carrying in those connections?
Yeah, bringing it back into connection for sure. So I would say on some level, everyone has what you may have heard as the abandonment wound. Because when we are separated from our mother, there is a deep, experience of abandonment happening there for an infant. So no matter how gentle your childbirth is, no matter how gentle your incubation period was, there's always abandonment. However, after that, most of our parents weren't equipped with the tools to attune to what our needs were as a child. So now we start to see neglect wounds and trust wounds and wounds that create hyper independence within children, and children believing they have to take care of themselves. They have to handle everything for themselves. And that branches out into attachment theory, where there's anxious and avoidant, and that's sliding spectrum, in my opinion. It's not like you're one or the other. And as adults, those wounds continue to play out because they were never addressed because we just don't know any better.
And that is one thing that we hear a lot about, especially is the attachment styles and really understanding that. I read the book Attached, and I thought it was really fantastic, and they did a lot of research on that, and definitely can recommend that. And I'm sure there's others. And also in this trauma, one big trauma that you see is the abandonment, and that gets carried in, which is interesting because that isn't about the current connection, right? So if in our connection, even if you didn't abandon me, or one of my potential prospects in a connection didn't abandon me, we're holding that, right? We're holding that trauma and carrying it over. And some people call that baggage.
Yeah, absolutely. And yeah, there's a couple of things I want to say to piece this together. The abandonment wound can obviously be deepened by a parent being unavailable, or even like an early love that came with a lot of rejection. And if we don't have the tools to handle rejection from a place of neutrality and knowing that it's not about us, then the pain deepens and it reminds us of this childhood experience. However, the contradicting thing, or where it becomes a little convoluted, is because we love our parents, we equate the abandonment also to love. And so that means we can continue to attract these dynamics and these partnerships that also trigger our deepest wounds until they're looked at and healed. So the reason why I might come into a relationship with you and feel very good about it, and then cross a threshold of attachment where I'm starting to really care about you or the person I'm in connection with, and I get this pushback of fear, is because this fear of abandonment is like under the surface, and I'm just waiting for the other shoe to drop in a way.
Do you feel that most people are carrying some sort of this abandonment trauma?
Yeah, I would say that. And in the book Attached, I think that they share that the research shows that most people are secure, and I would absolutely disagree. I think that most people are insecure or outside of secure attachment. And like that book also puts it a little bit black and white, but there's other books that dive deeper into the concept more from a psychological point where it shows how it's a sliding scale. But yeah, I do think we all have this just because of the fact that the generation before us wasn't looking at this work, and our parents and their parents, there was different things going on. It was wartime, it was survival time, and there just wasn't the time to feel our feelings or reflect on. And there's so much suppression that happens, which also gets passed down. It's pretty hard to avoid, unfortunately. But now what's becoming more and more mainstream is the language and the tools and everything to heal it and to work with it.
So let's start with abandonment. I'm coming in with abandonment issues into this connection, this potential relationship. What are some things that I can work on, or that someone can work on for this particular trauma that is a common one?
Yeah, I think step one is awareness. So if you notice that you're getting into similar relationship dynamics over and over that don't feel good, unfortunately, we have to stop and recognize, where am I the common denominator here? So getting that awareness, what am I feeling? What's going wrong? Reflecting a little bit on the past and what might my trauma be? I'm just getting curious about it, getting to know these terms with an attachment style. And from there, I think the next step is being able to name it when it's happening, even if it starts with just naming it for yourself. So, for example, if you go on a date and the person seems super available and they're super interested in you and they're super loving and they want to see you again, and that creates a reaction in your body of, ugh, like ick, like it actually feels like you want to close away, that's probably a hint that something is going on there, because we are wired fundamentally for connection, for compassion, to be open, to be loving. And it's only the trauma and the defense systems that get built up that close us from this happening. So level 1 being awareness, level 2 being able to name it as you see it playing out in real time. And level 3 is feeling it in your body. And so this is the somatic piece. And if we can slow down those moments, even just by ourselves in meditation or in reflection, and really feel like, what happens in my body when I feel like that? Does my heart start racing? Are my hands sweaty? Do I feel like a pit in my stomach? Because this is showing us what's in the body and where our body is feeling fear. And then deeper than that is the reparenting level. And I'm simplifying this so much, but just to take someone through the process, is that reparenting, that self-soothing, the reminder of, I'm safe, I'm allowed to have this, or this is crossing a boundary for me and I also feel that in my body and I actually do need to exit this partnership because it's crossing a boundary.
Can you simplify reparenting? What does that mean?
Yeah. So I think that the term is quite literal. It's explaining how maybe our parents didn't give us the things we needed, unfortunately, to thrive and to be secure. So now as adults, it's our job to reparent ourselves, even in an adult body. This kind of goes hand in hand with the term inner child work, which is getting in touch with actually what is an undeveloped or underdeveloped or immature part of our psyche. So if I am 4 years old and my dad is a really busy entrepreneur and he's working all the time, and I create a story that he doesn't have time for me, or everyone doesn't have time for me, or I am not worthy of other people's time, that's my little 4-year-old brain made that plan and was like, from now on, this is what I need to believe to survive and to get love. I need to respond in a certain way. I need to not bother him when he's busy, or not bother men in general when they're busy. And that's, in the most gentle sense of the word, it's immature and underdeveloped. So this reparenting acknowledges that these defense systems that we created were from a really young part of our brain that just didn't have all the logical awareness that we have now. And I think that's why when people start the personal development path or the path of healing and healing trauma, the awareness level isn't enough, because it's still fighting against a pattern that we've practiced for so long. So we have to drop deeper than the awareness level into what our body believes and our subconscious. And this is that where we find those parts of our psyche that are just young, and we introduce them to who we are now and how capable we are now and what we want now and what our life is like now. And that alone just provides so much permission and so much space and so much safety, knowing that we are holding that part of ourselves that is afraid.
If someone wanted to start working on this and they are aware, they go on a date or they have a prospective lover or partner and they start feeling this and they can name it, that's what I hear is the first step, is recognition. And then what's the next step after that for them?
Yeah, I think the next step would be having a discussion about it, especially if it's a partner that you see yourself spending extended amount of time with, that you want to form a healthy attachment with, is trying to communicate that with them. Of course, some people might also not know how to handle it due to their own experience or their own trauma. But once you're at that level of understanding, you can't help but basically demand someone else who can meet you at that depth, because now you've entered like a new level of your own depth. So on one hand, you'll probably just naturally start attracting people that are available for that, willing to go there or already there. Or it shows you, hey, this person isn't available to go to this depth with me. And after that, it's still a lot of self-responsibility. When it happens, noticing if you have a tendency to self-sabotage the relationship, to hurt your partner, to try and manipulate your partner, and taking ownership within yourself for that desire, and seeing if you can choose, seeing what capacity you have to choose a different way to stay when there is a lot. If someone feels needy, to stay in that energy, to stay in that love, and stay in the thing that you've identified that yourself, your adult, mature self actually wants, and just to practice holding it and holding it.
So you have to know what you want and be able to communicate that in that connection. And if you want to move into the somatic part, what does that look like? How does someone get there? And they've recognized, they see the pattern, they're communicating it, and now they want to get that out of their bodies, stored somewhere in their bodies? Are we punching pillows and screaming? What are we doing here?
Yeah, there's definitely emotional expression that happens. I will say that somatic therapy and this deeper work is quite hard to facilitate alone, especially if you've never experienced it, because you just don't know what to expect. And the same parts of you that have stopped you from feeling the emotions or feeling the trauma in the first place are going to try and stop you from doing this work. Your mind will make you tired or dissociate or distract you. So it definitely is a disciplined practice to be able to follow it all the way through and to stay with the emotion. So depending on the level of experience or willingness people are to feel their emotions, just sitting for 2 minutes to feel like anxious can be really uncomfortable. So that would be a good warm up practice, just like feeling what is alive in my body. But what often happens as we go a little bit deeper, what might feel like in the beginning, oh, I have this pain and tightness in my shoulder. When I feel into it more and when I'm prompted with, is there an emotion there? Oh, actually, that emotion is frustration. Okay. Does the frustration have something it wants to express? And sometimes when we invite these sensations within our body to express, the language it comes up with doesn't necessarily seem to make sense at the time because, again, it's these younger beliefs. So this is a personal example that I'm giving here. And when I had this feeling, I was just like, I just want you to get away from me. Please leave me alone. Just please leave me alone. And it took me a while to really connect. What was that? Like, why did I want to be left alone? And it was because of childhood experiences where my father was really like demanding of us to work on the farm. And so when you live on a farm, it's early mornings and long hours. And I think a part of me was just too young for that work or just needed more patience and more time. And so I created this like bracing for when he was going to wake me up at 6 in the morning to go work on the farm. And I can appreciate it now. And it built character and it built resiliency. But there was a part of me that felt like all of this frustration, but I had to keep it here because I needed to show up and go to work. Does that make sense?
Yeah, that does not sound like fun, waking up that early and working on the farm. So you actually felt it physically in your body? Like you were storing that in your body? Like where was it for you?
Yeah, exactly. So this shoulder tension is like down my neck and the back of my shoulder blade. And this is an example of chronic muscle tension. And whenever I am putting a lot of pressure on myself, I feel it coming back alive, or that's where my body stores it because it's almost there's this weakened area from the initial trauma, let's call it, or the initial emotional suppression. So now when that same self pressure or something that matches the same frequency as the original event is happening, that's where I feel it in my body. Another example, though, can be digestion issues or stomach pain. And again, it makes perfect sense because it's like the body is squeezing and holding on to something and holding on for safety. So when we can just feel into that part of our body, whether it's literally the pain that is forever lingering in your intestines or whatever it is, and just being there with it and feeling like, what is here? Oh, I feel scared. Okay, can we allow the scaredness to be here? Is there something else there? I feel overwhelmed. I don't know what the answer is. And just allowing ourselves to just feel what's in the body. And sometimes there's big emotional waves that come with that, tears and waves of sadness. And starting to tap into this can unlock a depth of emotion that has been held in the body. So it's a sensitive journey to go on. We have to give ourselves a lot of compassion and space, but the work comes with so much liberation after because we get to get rid of the parts of us that were just there for survival and just there to create unhealthy ways to get love. And now that's not in the way anymore. And now I just get to have what I want. And that's totally liberating. I'm just going to plug my computer. Go ahead.
It's okay. Wait a second. So basically, if you want, so part of releasing the trauma stored in your body is just feeling it.
Yeah. Yeah. Does it, what feels too simple or what is the disbelief in the explanation, I guess?
I was just hoping you're going to tell me I need to get massages every day and
Sure, you can do that. You can help move the energy around.
So by just feeling it, that will release that pain or that tension in the body.
For sure. And depending on where the tension is from, like maybe I have a little bit of anxiety from something that happened today. So for me to release it is pretty simple. It's pretty surface. It's right there. Then there's the deeper patterns, like I said, like my shoulder pain, for example, which a big release can happen, and then it's still lingering and it's still there and it comes back because it's what my body knows and has practiced for 30 years. So there's different levels of needing to tend to ourselves and needing to reparent. And I actually had an experience about 3 weeks ago where we were doing some work in my sacral area or pelvic area, which is a really big one for lots of people. So if we're feeling hip pain or any like dysfunction around sexuality, there's probably often a trauma there, or a trauma that's linked to this area of the body. And so this few weeks ago, I had a very big emotional, like blood curdling scream. And that's not normal. And so when I am practicing with people, I really want them to know that sound is so welcome. And sometimes the sound that comes out of our body, it's just like foreign. It's like, how did I even have that inside me, basically? But because it was such a big expression, I thought, oh, it's done. It's clear. That was big. I'm done with it. Today, in a different workshop, I felt like the same thing bubbling up and still being there. And I had this smaller frustration release, and I realized, there's a little bit more to do in there. And last night I did a yoga class that was really hip focused. And I would say that is why it started to unlock again, because I created space within my body and then things are moving. And the last piece I want to say to that is all emotions can be our energy. It's like a chemical cocktail that gets released in the body, and all of that is energy. And so I don't want to say that from like a woo standpoint. It's just literally scientific. That's just what energy is. And so when we move and create space, energy moves in the body. And the more we can know our body and know ourself, which also comes with knowing our needs and knowing our boundaries, the easier this stuff is to work with.
So many people don't know what it means to move energy. Can you explain what that is, or some examples in a practical sense?
Maybe I'm overthinking it, but a yawn is your body moving energy, basically. It's like wanting oxygen. So it's like, whatever. It's like, it's asking for energy in a way, but it's moving energy. What's another example? If you ever feel a desire to shake your hands, it's because your body wants to move energy. We see children doing it super effortlessly because they haven't been told not to, like stamping their feet or yelling or like just shaking their body or jumping around. And it's because their body's saying move energy and they don't have anything telling them to stop. So our body knows what to do, actually, when we give it a little bit of space.
So basically, listen to your body. If you want to shake, if you want to scream, then we should be doing that and not suppressing that.
Yeah, for sure. And I guess the thing that came to mind for that is it doesn't mean that I can be completely uncontained and everyone just needs to deal with my emotional expression all of a sudden, still in a healthy way. Of course, in session, that's usually a container. But if you're doing this on your own, if you need space from a conversation because you're feeling a lot of emotion that doesn't feel like safe to express, and you want to take yourself into a room and cry or breathe or make sounds or slam a pillow into the wall or just push into the wall, then of course that's the healthy way to move the energy.
And so we talked about abandonment and got into how to move that through the body. And if someone doesn't know, they just call you or find another. What are they looking up?
They can look for a somatic therapy practitioner or somatic experiencing.
Great. And then they'll help them with that. What are some other sort of common traumas that come into connections, that like in our daily connections that we carry through, either that we're pulling in from childhood, or that maybe let's talk about the ones first that are the baggage, the things that are carried over from prior relationships?
Yeah, from prior relationships, I guess the trust one is an obvious one, and it can be really hard to come back from being cheated on into another relationship because first, I want to say that response that people have of feeling not trusting of the next person or feeling doubt or feeling afraid that they're going to be cheated on is so valid. And it's this brilliant survival mechanism that our brain has that says, hey, that last situation hurt a lot. So we need to look out for that, like on red alert. And so that's the primal part of your brain that's trying to keep you safe. But really, the technology that we have within our body is so much more evolved than that. So again, it starts with the same thing, like working to recognize just because it happened there doesn't mean it's going to happen here. How can I communicate to this partner that this does feel scary for me? Like, hey, person I'm dating, when you do this, I notice that I feel afraid that you're going to cheat on me. I need reassurance by you texting me at least every 3 hours when you're out. We have to be able to ask for these things. And sometimes those simple requests can feel so scary because we're so scared of not getting that need met that we don't even name it in the first place.
Yeah, I think that's important, being able, if we're starting a new connection, especially if you know that there is trauma in that connection, or you're bringing trauma into this new connection, that being able to speak to it and vulnerably share, of saying, hey, I want to let you know that I've been cheated on not once, but twice, but three times. And
Mm-hmm.
I keep choosing people that are doing this. And maybe we need to recognize that and be aware that is relationships or connections that we're choosing, but being
Mm-hmm.
able to cut off that pattern and then come back to trust, especially if there is that trust is missing or there is trauma around trust. How do we recognize, first of all, that we're bringing that trust trauma into a relationship,
Mm-hmm.
and then now we can communicate that and say, hey, I want you to know here that I've been cheated on a lot and trust is a bit difficult for me.
Mm-hmm.
And here's the things that would make me feel safe. And they may not be able to step up and do all those things, but at least they're aware of it. And that person can choose whether they can be able to provide that safety to create that trust. Is there certain things that you've learned to be able to deal with some of these trust traumas?
Yeah, I feel like you just walked through the process, but the start of that is, how do I recognize that it's happening in the first place? So, of course, I can acknowledge I've been cheated on. How I might recognize it in the next relationship is the mental chatter of, they're probably cheating on me, or they're probably with someone else. And then slowing down when that comes up and just asking, like, is that true? And you might still think yes. And then ask again, is it 100% true? The answer is probably no. It's probably no. And just giving yourself that time to slow down and the no, it's probably not true. And if it keeps coming up, of course, like you said, going down that path of asking for what you need. And if they're willing to meet you, they are. If they're not, and then you just know that person can't meet your needs.
Has someone ever cheated on you?
Not that I know of, actually. However, in my past relationship, or two relationships ago, he had been cheated on by his only two other long term girlfriends, and his dad cheated on his mom. So just
Yeah.
imagine not only seeing your parents go through a divorce because of that, but then he stayed with his mom, who got very sick. And so he has all of this trauma, of course, around like all of the pain that came with that, the splitting up of the family, getting split up from his brother. And then it plays out in his relationship. And so then when I get into a relationship with him, on the other end, I'm just feeling all this confusion and a little bit of anger, because I'm thinking, how can you think that I would cheat on you? I would never cheat on you, because I know myself. So then it becomes like a really tough thing to navigate, and to have him just feeling so paranoid all the time. In hindsight, I have so many more tools now to have communicated with him better. But from my unconscious not knowing and his unconscious trauma, it just created like loops and loops of pain. And if we had identified it sooner, I think we could have lasted a lot longer in the relationship. But in the end, he even worked a lot on it through therapy. But I got to a point where I was so walking on eggshells all the time that I actually couldn't come back from it. And that was really disappointing as well. But it was 4 years into the relationship. And I just remember I was at a spin class and my phone died. And then I stayed after to talk to people for a while. And as I was driving home, I was thinking, he's going to be so mad. He's going to think I was cheating on him because I was home late. And I got home and he was just like, hey, babe. And I thought, I'm not in trouble. But it really showed me like where my nervous system was. So it was almost like I had become traumatized from his trauma in a way. And it was all due to lack of communication skills and lack of being able to name it and lack of being able to ask for our needs to each other. Totally
Yeah.
resolvable, actually, in my opinion.
There's a story that comes up for me as you're speaking. My first love, I asked her to marry me, and we were on the way to that. And then her father came out and had told the family, and they were very religious. He was a pillar of this religious community,
Mm.
and she looked up to him so much. And he came out and said, I've been cheating on my wife. He told the family, on your mother, with her best friend, with his wife's
Mm.
best friend. For
Mm.
4 years it was going on. And I
Mm-hmm.
think that the kick on this was, he also then came and said that he felt God was saying this was okay and had its blessing on this. And I
Mm.
remember how much that destroyed her. This was her father who she looked up to so much.
Mm-hmm.
And the result of that was crushing to me, because for her, if her father who would do that, who's really the shining star in her life, then as another man, that's going to happen to her with me. And she literally got up and moved to Italy. And just, I was like, what is happening here?
Mm-hmm.
And just being on the other end of that, of how much that this trust breaking creates a trauma that is going to then carry forward, not in our own lives, but actually ripples out all around us. And
Mm-hmm.
how important it is to have that integrity within ourselves. To, if that is not within your boundaries in a relationship or in a connection, of just how, it's better just to recognize, I want to go do this thing. It's important to me to have this other physical connection. It's not in the boundaries of our own relationship. And either one, talk about it, or two, just say, I need to end this
Mm-hmm.
because I want this other thing. And
Mm-hmm.
how by doing that, actually, because we're so afraid of hurting someone, right?
Mm-hmm.
If I break up with someone because I'm attracted or want to have a sexual interaction with this other person, we think that's going to hurt someone so bad. But how much trauma is created by getting broken up with beforehand because someone wants this, or getting cheated on? Do you feel like there's a different scale there?
Yeah, I think when there's cheating, there's trust broken. So, of course, coming into it with a conversation, which is still probably going to be painful, of, hey, I'm noticing my feelings for this other person. I need to end our partnership here because of that. There's always going to be a level of respect that's held because of the communication, and the trust wasn't fully broken. So I would say that if we were asking which could be more traumatizing, of course it's cheating, but it also depends on the person and how they can hold themselves and how secure they are and how we can process it. And as you were saying that, I think there's such an important thing to talk about here, is that we have to give ourselves permission to acknowledge how painful heartbreak is. Like, it is really, to the body, almost identical to losing someone to death, and like the same level of grief. And so I think we can write off heartbreak or think that we shouldn't feel the way we're feeling or feel the pain we're feeling. But if you're feeling it, you're feeling it. It's in your body. You're not making it up. And so I just want to put that in there as well, because it's all so valid to need a healing period, no matter how the relationship ended. If it was painful for you, it was painful.
Yeah, Brene Brown in Atlas of the Heart, she really defines the different emotions that humans go through. And when she talks about heartbreak and breakups, she actually talks about it's the same emotions that's happening as grief, as you say.
Mm-hmm.
And many of us have lost people that we really love, and we know how that feels. And that breakup is akin to that. So
Mm-hmm.
that can also be really traumatizing. I want to move on and just say, what are some of these other these other traumas that happen in a relationship? So trust is a big one, and also abandonment is a big one. Is there any other ones that you hear a lot of?
Yeah, I think the concept of self abandonment in relationship is a big one, which would
Mm.
also stem from a trauma of emotional neglect, I would say. So, if we were taught that our emotions don't matter, if we were shown that we need to babysit the emotions of the adults around us, or be able to constantly respond to the emotions of the adults around us, or be anticipating of the emotions, it's a lot for a child. And so, often that turns into this people pleasing behavior. And I think that's a term that's pretty well known. And now, when you find someone that you're attracted to, it can be really easy to pedestal them. And when we pedestal someone, we've put them above or more worthy in our minds than who we are, it's really easy to compensate our boundaries over and over to get their love. And that might show up as clearing your schedule for a new love interest. You're completely available, you're never busy, you're always moving things around. And that can even get as extreme as feeling anxious about having commitments that are outside of that person, because it's, what if they ask me to hang out? And so this is self-betrayal, and this people pleasing can really happen, and also on a physical boundary level, an emotional boundary level, time boundary level. So definitely something to acknowledge when going into a relationship is, do I have a tendency to over give and overexert myself for this person? And if yes, is it creating a resentment in me? Because if there is a resentment or this feeling of they don't see me, they're not meeting my needs, why can't they understand what I need when I can understand what they need? So it's just going to create, this resentment and this sort of pushing away while still wanting to pull so close. And that's not real connection.
Yeah, for sure. I also feel some other ones that I feel come up in connections that traumatizes the connection in between two people that
Mm-hmm.
aren't baggage being brought in, but are actually traumas that happen in the connection. Or if someone loses their temper
Mm-hmm.
and gets angry, says something mean. Maybe some other ones could be boundaries aren't kept, whether that is time boundaries, which I guess maybe goes back to trust and integrity, but
Mm-hmm.
also boundaries. If they don't want to be touched in a certain way and they communicate that, or maybe they don't communicate that and those boundaries get crossed, that can create trauma in the connection. Is there any other ones that you can think of that are either common that or traumas that happen within the connection between those two people that aren't brought in from prior?
Yeah, I think we listed the top categories, and it always comes down to a boundary being crossed, especially when it was communicated, but sometimes unknowingly. So we can have really shocking experiences where we didn't even anticipate the person would behave that way. And that shock can be really traumatizing as well, especially when you have come to believe that they love you, that you can trust them. And if now all of a sudden they've disappeared or they're stonewalling you or they're refusing to communicate, that would probably be traumatizing because it's this disconnect between what we expected and anticipated from them and maybe what we believed we were being communicated versus what happened.
Yeah, I know I definitely have had trauma from stonewalling. That was a
Mm-hmm.
big one, I think, in my marriage. That was really hard. When my
Mm-hmm.
wife was upset or angry or felt like I did something that hurt her, she would just shut down. There was
Mm-hmm.
no physical affection. There was no time. There was no quality time in the love languages. And there was
Mm-hmm.
just no communication. And that was harder than throwing things or getting angry.
Mm-hmm.
And I definitely feel that is also a trauma is actually withdrawing that love and
Mm-hmm.
withdrawing that communication for sure.
Yeah, yeah. So her behavior is a trauma response on some level to her pain and her not wanting to feel it or acknowledge it or whatever. And then for you on the other side, there can be this panic of, please come back to me. Where did you go? I want to get in front of you. I want to talk about this. I want to work this out. And it's the polar opposite, and that contrast creates a lot of pain. Yeah.
So I think I want to talk about a little bit this idea of the trauma scale.
Mm.
Originally, when I was creating the connection map, I had two sort of categories. One of them was the amount of past trauma within the connection. Someone has hurt each other, broken trust, boundaries broken, whatever that is. And then
Mm-hmm.
the second one was the amount of trauma remaining. Originally, I actually had three: past trauma, healed trauma equals the amount of trauma remaining.
Mm.
And then simplified that just to the amount of remaining trauma within the connection. And that is what we can scale because it felt to me the most relevant thing was how much trauma is within that connection currently. Do you feel like that is a good way to quantify? Because what we're trying to do is really talk about all the qualities of the connection, things like trust, sexuality, experiences, the ease of communication, things of that sort. And so this one category is just trauma remaining,
Mm-hmm.
which to me it really is an accumulation or of was there trauma that happened in the relationship or in this connection? How much of that was healed? This is what's left over.
Mm-hmm.
And do you feel like that's enough to be able to accurately describe a connection? Is how much trauma remains within that connection?
Yeah, I like the term trauma remaining or remaining trauma. I'm just feeling like there's the remaining trauma we have as an evolved human coming into a relationship. So, what of our baggage has been managed and what isn't managed. And then, of course, when the relationship, as it happens, maybe there's traumas and experiences together. And then there's still unresolved trauma that's within our container. And so there might be two different ways that can be acknowledged. But something really important here is that trauma, healing of trauma happens in relationship to another. We can learn about it separate, we can process separate, but the healing has to come from this connection, actually. And it can be the connection to your therapist or the connection to your coach or a connection to a friend or a loved one, but it happens in connection. So if I'm coming into a relationship with X% or X type of remaining trauma, with my awareness, with being able to ask for my needs, with clear boundaries, then there's usually a really big opportunity for a lot of that to be resolved within a new, secure, trusting relationship.
Yeah, I think when I was looking at this and originally had all these separate categories, and when we're doing the connection map, we're trying to create a way to be able to quickly and easily talk about the connection that we have with someone so that we can just have better language and be able to communicate to our friends, our family, like, this is what we have. And I was really struggling with the trauma scale to know how much do we need to talk about just the trauma that happens between with two people, right? Because ultimately, if I'm having a connection with someone, whether it's a friendship, a working partnership, or a prospect of a romantic partnership, you would think it would just be enough to talk about how much trauma have we had in that connection? Did we hurt each other? Did we not hurt each other? And maybe we didn't hurt each other at all, and we've been in full integrity with all of our communication and our boundaries. But then I realized that, but in reality, some of that trauma, we could fold in that past trauma because it seemed that past trauma is also relevant to the current connection. And so maybe in our connection, we've had no trauma at all. And that feels relevant because I feel like I can trust you, I can communicate with you, we can talk honestly and openly, and we have a good platonic intimacy, and you haven't hurt me at all, right? But maybe we both have trauma that is affecting our dynamic. So my question is, how much weight do we give that sort of those past baggage we're bringing in? How much weight do we give to the current connection as opposed to just focus on how much trauma is in the reality that's happened within that specific connection at that time?
Yeah, I guess it depends if you're reflecting on the relationship as something of the past, in which case it can and already has had its own experiences and potential traumas. But if I'm talking about something I'm pursuing now, or just a couple months into, let's say, or what feels like the beginning stages, then we want to, I think what would be the most helpful, I'm literally just thinking of this as we're having this conversation, is more like how much are my trauma responses being triggered by this person? So maybe I'm like 10 out of 10 physically attracted to this person, but because I have a wound of feeling like I'm not worthy of time and they're a really busy entrepreneur, I'm like super dysregulated around them and feeling like really anxious around them. So then that becomes relevant where we have a great sexual connection, but I'm highly triggered in a way or dysregulated by this person. And so therefore is the compatibility for, I don't know, like a dating partnership. Am I ready for it? The way to look at it.
So do you feel that like the scale isn't the trauma remaining, is the more relevant scale, is what I'm hearing is maybe looking at it as the trauma being triggered from this connection. But that also needs to be folded into the actual trauma that happens in the connection. So if you and yell and scream at me and I am triggered by that and that trauma is there, then the trauma scale will go up. If you cheat on me, the trauma scale will go up. But you're saying maybe it's not even about the amount of trauma, it's the amount of triggering of the trauma that is relevant to the connection.
Because I feel like that's something that can be identified along the way and ideally dropped along the way. So I might feel my anxious attachment style might be really highly triggered when I meet you, but as we create trust, as I tell you my needs and as I get my needs met and my boundaries are trusted and respected, then actually my trigger level is dropping and dropping as our connection is deeper and healthier and more secure.
So what would be a good name for this trauma scale? Is it like triggered? It's almost like is it still trauma, remaining trauma, or is it like just, can we call it relevant trauma, or is it like relevant trauma that is triggered? How do we create the language around this trauma scale so that people can really look at that and get it and say, this is not big words. It's, oh, in my connection, there's a lot of, we call it trauma triggering level or trauma triggering scale, because then it could be, yeah, this person, and I have people in my lives that are really triggering to me, right? They just say things and I don't know why, but it's really hard, right? And it feels uneasy. And there's people that are just really simple. What words can we use to name this scale that feels relevant to you?
Yeah, so I do think unfortunately, the word trigger is pretty overused. And so it's a hard one. It's almost like a laughable word at this point, unfortunately, even though it is a powerful word and what it means. But becoming dysregulated would be what's happening in the experience. So I feel like trigger ability, trigger like something like 5 out of 5, he's triggering my nervous system to be dysregulated. But it's a little bit too like light or a little bit laughable, I think. And I just feel like there's a couple different terms here. Like this remaining trauma is definitely an important concept, but it depends at which point are you looking at the relationship. Are you looking at it in hindsight, in which case you can talk about trauma incurred in that relationship and then trauma resolved and trauma remaining. Or you could take my whole life journey of trauma and say, I came into this relationship with this remaining trauma, and the trauma healed within the relationship was this amount, or this is what happened.
So the connection map always maps a connection at one point in time, because as a connection is really, it's constantly shifting and changing. So the connection map would be, we're going to map our connection at this moment in time. But, and again, like I said, originally I had all these different sliders of trauma in the past, trauma healed, what's remaining. And now it's almost, there almost feels like there could be another scale if we wanted to really expand this out and branch out and go to a deeper level of a connection map, which is having all those scales, and another one, would be something around with the trigger, like the trauma trigger scale. And which might be from past, or it might be, or it's basically an accumulation of past traumas into this connection and so on. I'm just wondering what do we call, if we have one scale with trauma, how do we identify, and how do you feel we would scale this part of a connection? Is it based on the triggering, or the amount of trauma it's almost like the relevant trauma to the connection, right? What
Yeah.
is the relevant trauma?
Yeah, and I'm also thinking of like trauma response activation scale. So how activated are my trauma responses getting, which on one hand is like how much am I bringing into the relationship in the first place, but looking at the connection, it's how triggered am I getting, or how activated are my trauma responses, and it can range from like calm seas to basically like unpredictable tornadoes, because the top level would be like you don't really know when it's coming and there's this I don't know what I'm going to get, and then somewhere in between is like a patterned trauma response.
Definitely, I'll think about that a little bit and try to figure out a good name for that, because I feel in this conversation what's come up for me is, it seems the relevant part of the traumas in a connection is really how it's the past traumas, any current traumas that's happened within the two people, because a connection, we're only mapping between two people. So if you get upset with me, or these things, cheating happens, that increases that trauma scale, which is, maybe it's almost trauma like sensitivity, or it could be, yeah, relevant trauma feels like it could be a good way to look at this scale, because that can encompass things from the past, things from the present relationship or the present connection. I'm wondering, but none of them seem to perfectly encapsulate what I feel like we're trying to quantitatively scale. And again, this is a scale of 1 to 10. The idea is not to try to hit every nitpicky part of the connection, but just give an overview and a cognition of, hey, in this connection, there's some trauma that has happened here. And that is a big part of the connection.
Yeah, it's really hard for me to differentiate or put this together because it really feels like two things. And
Hmm.
even if we say that we don't want to think about anything outside of the connection, so I am like wherever I am in the relationship with my trauma, there's definitely this trigger response activation scale, like how much do they trigger my trauma responses, but it doesn't really speak to the piece of how much trauma happened in the relationship. So it would have to be
Yeah.
clarified. It's trigger me to an 8, but because they cheated on me. And so there is that like nuance that maybe you're trying to eliminate by making like clear
Mhm.
scales. But I think that scale is actually a way more relevant one for me to also reflect on the relationship, for me to describe to someone else, because people will understand what that is. It's like a big activation in the body when someone is triggering us in the basic sense of the word. Yeah.
So you feel the most relevant thing in a connection in relation to trauma is how much are we getting triggered in this connection, basically?
Yeah. And out of what you're saying versus remaining trauma and trauma that occurs in the relationship, I just feel like this trigger response scale, let's call it, is
Yeah.
the most straightforward thing to be
Hmm.
able to name and identify within ourselves, most likely, if we know what our trauma is to begin with. Or, yeah.
Do you feel in relation to a connection, when we're defining the connection that two people have, does it matter if their trigger response scale is an 8 because that person cheated on them, or it's an
Mhm.
8 because they've been cheated on 10 times before? Do you still feel like that is the connection, right? That is
Mhm.
part of the connection, is that they're getting triggered in this connection,
Mhm.
regardless of why it's there in the connection.
Yeah, I feel like actually, now that you say it, on a body response level, it's the same, whether it happened from them or
Yeah.
from someone else. I might identify that it feels closer because it happened within this relationship, but then I might put it at a 9 versus because it was a past relationship, I
Yeah.
might just put it as an 8 anyway. So that's an interesting way to, yeah, describe it for sure.
Because it feels like whatever's relevant to the connection, like the now is the only thing relevant to a connection. How do I feel now? Because
Mm-hmm.
I could have 10 people cheating on me in the past,
Mm-hmm.
but maybe I've healed that, or I'm not worried about it, or I've come to a
Mm-hmm.
place of trust. So it doesn't seem relevant if to my current connection with someone in that moment, if I've been able to do the work or hire someone like yourself to help me, or whatever the reason, or I just did a lot of meditation, I'm good now. And that's not relevant to the connection. It almost, to me, that's what seems to be the relevant part to a connection, is what is really there in that connection, regardless of what's happened in the past or where it came from.
Yeah.
It's what's there, what's really there, and how is it affecting our connection.
Mm-hmm.
If I meet you and I'm just like, whoa, I don't trust anyone, and I'm like a dog that's been kicked before
Mm-hmm.
and now is like very jumpy, and then that's relevant to the connection. Whereas if I've been kicked in the past but I'm good now, it seems relevant. Do you feel that's true, or it's a good way to look at it, or not?
Yeah, no, I think it is because we can have trauma. I think, as Gabor Mate also describes it, it's not always what happened, it's what happened after. And so
Mm.
I gave this as an example, and I think it's a really good way to conceptualize it. But if I'm 5 years old and we're playing at the pool and an adult just throws me in and I'm really caught off guard and I get water in my nose and I come up and I'm like
Mm.
coughing and I'm really mad, and the adult goes, "Oh, don't worry about it. Like, it's just water. Get over it."
Yeah.
There's an opportunity to be really traumatized by that because my experience was completely invalidated. If the same thing happens, the adult still throws me in the pool, I'm still panicked, I'm still upset, but the adult comes down to my level and says, "Hey, I'm so sorry. I didn't mean to scare you. I hope you know I'm going to make sure you're safe. Do you want to jump in the pool together?" Maybe
Mm.
there's no trauma. Like, my body's completely okay. I've been seen. I'm safe. It's okay. I'm okay to go back in the water. So I don't need to bring that into a relationship when it's been processed and healed. It
Mm.
doesn't, because it doesn't affect the connection.
Yeah, I understand that. You were talking about, you used some words earlier that when you were talking about the trauma, that it could be stormy or calm. One of the things that we're trying to do with the connection map is, when we scale each part of the connection, if there's no trauma, or there's extreme amounts of trauma, or there's some trauma, we want to be able to give people words to easily be able to talk about this connection,
Mm-hmm.
assuming that that part of that, that the trauma scale is relevant or it's a focus category, because sometimes it's just not an important part of the connection and it's not relevant or it's not a focus sort of category. And sometimes it is. We have people in our lives where that trauma is a big part of our connection, whether that means we're bonding over trauma, like those trauma bonding, or we're triggering a lot of trauma, or we're getting triggered in different ways. Is there any words or analogies you can think about that feel really good to be able to describe trauma scales? For example, I think I was using words like, if there's really high trauma all the time, that we could call it a toxic connection, and we can add it to all of our other words, like a deep rooted toxic lovership. We're adding all the words together, and we might take all those words and create another word later. But is there any sort of analogies that come up in trauma or that you find yourself using to describe connections or relationships that have high amounts of trauma, low amounts of trauma, medium amounts of?
Yeah, not in so many words that I've thought of before, but I love creating creative analogies. And so I'm trying to think of almost like different landscapes or different weather experiences that would link to how you feel. And so I think if the trauma is low and you feel very secure and trusting, it's like you're in a forest that you've been in before and it feels super safe and the weather is calm and the sun is shining and there's no clouds. So it feels safe. There's unknown parts and you can be curious, or you can walk the path that you know and you feel trusting that the path is going to go where it's going to go because you trust the person and it feels calm. Or it could just be like calm waters, something like that. And then as it increases, I think it's like the level of uncertainty or lack of control that starts to happen. So it can be raining and it can feel like it's always raining and that sucks, but like you can handle the rain and you can walk away from the rain. But then if we get into tornadoes, it's so unpredictable and it just feels like I'm so out of control or I'm stuck or I'm overwhelmed or I'm just like completely out of my body even in this experience because it's so triggering. So you could take that path.
So maybe I'm thinking I want to try to use, I want to, when creating these words, I want them to be logical and people are like, I get it. So there's no sort of like words that we talk about with traumatic relationships that you're aware of? Do people say toxic or unhealthy or things of that sort when there's a lot of
For
trauma?
sure. For sure. But toxic doesn't necessarily mean that I don't want to say it doesn't mean there wasn't trauma, but it's who was toxic. Were we both toxic? What was toxic about it? It's a little bit of a different topic almost. And so, of course, you can use the words like healthy and secure. Like in attachment style, we have anxious, secure, avoidant, and a couple other words as well. Can you keep speaking out what's in your mind and maybe it will come more clear to me?
Yeah. So let's say I meet someone and I just find that there's a lot of trauma that's happened there. Or I've been in a relationship for a while and there's just so much trauma that's happened. Lots of maybe yelling, screaming, cheating, whatever it is. I want to give a way to be able to signify that is a big part of that connection when I explain the connection. So I could say a tumultuous, or it's a tumultuous lovership, or it's a tumultuous whatever. Or I'm trying to find words that will make it easy for people to be like, oh, I hear the word tumultuous and I understand that, whoa, like there's trauma and it's difficult and it feels like someone on a boat that's rocking all over the place. And there's
Right.
just a lot of trauma involved with that.
Yeah, you could use the word activating, which is a somatic therapy term for sure, but I'm not sure it translates so easily. But if a relationship is hyper activating, for example, to me that would suggest that your nervous system is dysregulated because of their trauma response or our own inability to contain or be secure from our own responses.
So, what about stormy? Does stormy feel like that is, if I say to you, I have a stormy connection, do you think that do you think that there's a decent amount of trauma there?
I would associate it that way for
Yeah.
sure. I'm also deep in the space, so it might not be so obvious. But what starts to feel a little vague for me is it them or you, or does it matter?
Yeah.
So that's just,
I don't know if it matters because mapping a connection is what is, it's one, almost think of it like a bunch of chords, energetic chords between one person and the next. We're
mhm,
describing the quality of those chords. What is that? What is that entity that's created
mhm,
in between two people? If we could give it its own personality and give it its own words and traits, what is that thing that is created in between two people? So whether that trauma is your fault or my fault, I still think the connection has a negative quality to it. So it's stormy, it's rainy, maybe it's about what I like. You mentioned weather patterns, and I also was thinking that way too, that maybe we talk about weather patterns and it's sunny, it's cloudy, it's rainy, it's stormy, it's I don't know. It's a freaking hurricane. It's a class 5 hurricane coming through,
mhm.
or a tornado, or been in.
Yeah. Yeah, I think it could fit. I do want to just clarify, just maybe for people that are listening, that there is like a traumatic event could happen within a relationship, like someone cheating, but then the behaviors that are coming from either that trauma or outside traumas are a trauma response. So me
Mm-hmm.
yelling and screaming in response to you is a trauma response. It's not trauma, but maybe I'm traumatizing you by doing that, but it's just a little bit of a nuance there.
Thank you for that. Is there anything that you feel didn't get discussed here that feels really relevant to this conversation and this idea of trying to scale trauma?
Yeah, I think it's just with trauma, we really have to be clear. And I'm trying to thinking of the connection as an entity. And when we use a trauma defining word or one of the scale words, to me, the question mark is like, but who, where, from what side? And so that's where I think we can use a sentence like, that relationship activated my trauma responses 10 out of 10. And then I know it's about your body and your experience. Or we can say it was tumultuous, but then it's not giving me too many details.
Mhm. Yeah, you don't know what side it's coming from, right? Is that me being the instigator here, or is it the other person? And
Mm-hmm.
I think for the connection map, it's not, we're not trying to categorize each person on either side of the table. We're trying to say, when we get together and we have a connection, what is that entity that's created? And it's always through one person's perspective, because my connection to you is different than your connection to me. And then we can also do what's called a connection map overlay, which we can look at it from both ways. But my connection, when I map a connection or someone maps a connection, it's always from the individual to that other person, because
Mm-hmm.
it's the only thing that they can actually know. It's everything is perspective. I could feel a lot of trust with you, and you could potentially not feel that with me, and that could be my fault or not my fault. But what we're saying is that actually doesn't matter. We're not trying to get to the root of all these causes. We're just saying this is what's here in the connection. There's
Mm-hmm.
high trust, there's high sexuality, there's attraction, there's trauma, there's lots of past experiences together, there's been a lot of frequency, there's been a lot of, I perceive a lot of benefit, and I perceive that you get a lot of benefit from me, and there's that reciprocity there.
Mm-hmm.
So we're really just looking at it from one perspective, because in a connection, that's the only way that we can see a connection,
Yeah.
is through our own perspective, but we can overlay them. So,
Mm-hmm.
well, I do think if we were to take the connection map and take it to an advanced level, we need to break that into multiple quantitative scales, but maybe on the more basic level. Because right now, no one's ever seen a framework for human connection before. So
Mm-hmm.
if we try to make it pull in 200, which I think I could probably easily do, different parts of human connection, it almost becomes less useful and almost
Mm-hmm.
becomes irrelevant. So trying to keep it dialed in. So I
Yeah.
do appreciate and I agree with you on that.
Yeah. And as you were saying that, I think some things became a little bit more clear to me with the perspective of looking at it from me at the relationship. And I would break it down into like trauma incurred basically in that relationship and also trigger response level of that relationship.
Yeah. I like trigger response level. I think there might be a different way to say it, but that's what it is. It's like in this connection,
Mhm.
what's relevant is, are you getting triggered? How are you responding, right?
Yeah.
What
Yeah.
is
How
that?
does your body feel?
Maybe it's trauma response, and it might be a name for it, or trauma response level, because
Yeah.
then it's all about in the connection. What's relevant? How is it relevant that we're responding to this trauma or not,
Mhm.
regardless of what the trauma is or where it came from? Is it getting? Is there a response there?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, I feel like that is the most dialed in we've got so far on it.
Okay, let's repeat. We're calling it a trauma response level. You think that's the best one so far?
Yeah, yeah, and it could also be trigger response, depending how you define trauma or how
Yeah.
people define trauma within themselves. But it's how activated am I getting, or how dysregulated am I getting by this
Yeah.
person's presence, basically.
And I feel dysregulated is probably a better word. I'm not sure if everyone would relate to
For
that or
sure.
not. We're
Yeah.
trying to create the framework it's for everyone, right? The
Mhm.
best that we can. Amazing. Is there anything else that you feel like is important that you want to get out or feel like maybe wasn't talked about? If not, we'll start to wind down.
No, I feel like we covered a lot of bases,
Yeah.
and no, it feels good. I feel complete. I think it's good.
Amazing. Thank you so much for your time. I really appreciate it. And I feel like we were able to uncover some things and give some good ideas to people of this trauma and how to deal with it.